Hello, this is Dr. Clarence R. Pearson Sr., and welcome to My View, a podcast where I offer my professional perspective on today's most pressing geopolitical and socioeconomic issues. Recently, my attention has been drawn to developments concerning what I believe is an imbalance of power, war casualties, and the illogical claim to self defense by great powers. Here is my view on the matter: the architecture of asymmetry, why Trump's Iran rhetoric is a dangerous precedent for global order. A rules based order survives only if the powerful are willing to bind themselves to the same restraints they demand of others. That is the central moral and legal question raised by the current moment in the Middle East. For nearly 2 decades, the Israeli Palestinian conflict has produced an unmistakably asymmetric ledger of death. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, from 2008 to early October 2023, roughly 6,400 Palestinians and about 300 Israelis were killed in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel in the context of the conflict. Since October 2023, the Gaza war has driven Palestinian deaths above 72,000, according to the Gaza Health Ministry figures cited by OCHA and UN agencies, while the October 7th Hamas led attacks killed about 1,200 people in Israel. These numbers do not erase Israeli suffering, nor do they diminish the horror of the October 7th killings. They do, however, expose a deeper failure: the collapse of any credible claim that the international system values civilian life evenly. Once one side's overwhelming military advantage is repeatedly translated into overwhelming civilian death without meaningful restraint, proportionality stops functioning as a practical safeguard and becomes, at best, a contested word in legal debate. The International Court of Justice signaled the gravity of this problem in January 2024 when it referred to dehumanizing rhetoric coming from senior Israeli government officials and found the rights asserted by Palestinians under the Genocide Convention to be plausible enough to justify provisional measures. The International Criminal Court went further in November 2024, issuing arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. That already fragile legal order is now under fresh assault from the Trump administration's rhetoric on Iran. On April 5th, President Donald Trump publicly threatened to target Iran's power plants and bridges if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened by a deadline he imposed. Reuters reported that the threat came in explicit and inflammatory language, while the Associated Press noted that Iran and outside critics immediately framed such threats against infrastructure as potentially unlawful because they implicate objects indispensable to civilian life. This is not the language of responsible crisis management. It is the language of coercive spectacle. The legal stakes are plain enough. The UN Charter requires states to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and Article 51 recognizes self-defense only if an armed attack occurs. International humanitarian law then imposes a separate obligation even during armed conflict. Parties must distinguish between civilians and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives. Reuters' legal analysis on attacks against civilian installations notes that food supplies, water infrastructure, and energy sources essential for civilian survival are protected under the laws of war, and that prosecutions may follow where attacks fail the tests of military necessity, distinction, and proportionality. This is what makes Trump's rhetoric so dangerous. It does not simply threaten Iran. It teaches the world that civilian infrastructure can be spoken about as an acceptable bargaining chip. Once the President of the United States can casually threaten Power Plant Day and Bridge Day against a sovereign state, the old boundary between military target and societal punishment is weakened for everyone. Other powers, whether rivals, regional hegemons, or future imitators, will not miss the precedent. They will learn that if Washington can frame such threats as strategic necessity, then they too can present coercive attacks on essential infrastructure as lawful pressure rather than forbidden violence. That is a bad precedent, not only because it is inflammatory, but because it accelerates a broader moral collapse already visible in Gaza. In both contexts, the underlying logic is similar. One side's strategic goals are allowed to expand until the systems that sustain civilian life become fair game. In Gaza, that has meant repeated international concern over food, water, medicine, housing, and electricity. In Iran, the rhetoric now moves openly in the same direction, with infrastructure threatened as leverage. When the most powerful state in the international system adopts this language, it is not providing a solution to instability. It is globalizing the methods of instability. The damage is also political. The West has often defended the sanctity of international law when its adversaries violate it. The ICC's Ukraine related warrants over attacks on civilian infrastructure helped establish that energy systems and other life sustaining civilian objects cannot be casually destroyed under the mantle of war. But if Western leaders tolerate similar logics when applied by allies or threaten to use them directly in other theaters, they hollow out their own credibility. International law cannot be a shield for some and a loophole for others. A legal order that functions selectively becomes indistinguishable from an order based on power. For the global south, this lesson is already clear. Many states have long argued that the rules based order is enforced most vigorously against weaker or disfavored actors. The asymmetry of death in Palestine and the permissive rhetoric now directed at Iran will deepen that belief. And once enough states conclude that law is merely a vocabulary of convenience for the powerful, the practical result will be a more unstable world, more hedging, more unilateralism, more arms races, and less confidence that civilian life is truly protected by any universal standard. A just response begins with honesty. The deaths of Israelis and Palestinians do not carry different moral weight because one side is a state and the other is trapped under occupation and blockade. Nor does Iran's role in regional instability give the United States a license to publicly threaten infrastructure indispensable to civilian life. If global order is to mean anything, the child in Gaza, the civilian in Tehran, and the family in Tel Aviv must be protected by the same legal principles, not arranged within a hierarchy of strategic convenience. The world does not need more rhetoric that normalizes collective suffering. It needs a return to the hardest but most necessary rule of civilization, that human life cannot be defended by making other human lives disposable. Trump's ongoing rhetoric on Iran moves in the opposite direction. It is not a strategy for peace. It is a permission structure for disorder. It is therefore our collective responsibility to sound the alarm, and those with the power to do so put an end to these dysfunctions of traditional global order. My View is a continuing series where I share informed commentary on a wide range of geopolitical and socioeconomic topics. If you found today's discussion helpful, please follow, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I invite you to explore other My View episodes available online. Until we meet again, goodbye.